Welcome to Series 2 of our panel discussions to address COVID-19 and racial inequality. My name is Dr. Sharmon Monagan. I'm an alum of Nova Southeastern University with a doctorate in conflict analysis and resolution. Scholars for Healing and Racial Reconciliation is a group of leading experts in the fields of conflict analysis and resolution, law, public health, social justice, and counseling, brought together to address the greatest crises before our country and the world today. I am the principal organizer for this group, and I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. For today's panel, I would like to first introduce Dr. Jared O. Bell. Dr. Bell is an international development practitioner who focuses on post-conflict society building development. He is currently based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, where he leads the process for program and project design for USAID. A prolific author, Dr. Bell has published widely on transitional justice and human rights and is the author of the book Frozen Justice, Lessons from Bosnia and Herzegovina Failed Transitional Justice. Dr. Bell will discuss looking from the outside in, America's struggle to sell human rights and democracy in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Next is Dr. Stephanie Credle. Dr. Credle will discuss holy bias, calling religion to the altar of accountability, in which she will discuss religion's influence and impact in supporting and sustaining America's racial divide. Dr. Credle has over 30 years of diversity and inclusion in civil rights field. He has expertise in equal employment opportunity, and her dissertation was on the conflict in the African American church in the South. Again, my name is Dr. Sharmon Monagan. I'm an interpersonal conflict transformation expert, author of Fascist Trump, How Donald Trump's Rhetoric is Jeopardizing U.S. National Security, educator, CEO and founder of the Swinney Foundation, and a scholar with the focus on the intersectionality of race, gender, and politics. Today, I will discuss Black women, COVID, and racial justice. And lastly, we are honored to have our dear friend and colleague, Dr. T.Y. Okosun, as the moderator for our discussion. T.Y., has an extensive CV as an educator, author, and editor. He currently works as a professor of justice studies and African American studies at Northeastern Illinois University. I'll now turn over to TY's very capable hands.
All right, well, thank you, Sharmon. We've got three very accomplished individuals today that are going to help us weed through some of the issues that we've been dealing with for years. The pandemic is just a one-year experience, but the race issues in the United States and across the globe, actually, it's been almost 400 years and more. We're going to begin with Dr. Jared Bell. Jared Bell is going to be looking at the issues of human rights. Of course, human rights is extensive. He's going to be looking at it from the point of view of the local context, which is the United States, and then he's going to extend that to international interactions. And I think he's going to link the U.S. and the international scenario together in this presentation. And let's just begin with Dr. Bell, and then I'll introduce the next presenter and so on, and then before we start our discussion. So Dr. Bell.
Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this very important panel. This is a very pivotal discussion, not only domestically in the United States, but this is a discussion that's being held internationally. So as Dr. Monagan said, I'm based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's very interesting that I've come across people in the street, or even, friends of mine, or people, even I was buying cherries the other day, and one of the cashiers asked me, what's happening in America? It's not good, right? So America is on notice, right? And for a variety of reasons. For a long time, we've kind of played the role of international cop. We've played the role of arbiter in terms of human rights, and also kind of tried to maintain this kind of moral hegemony in terms of human rights and democracy. Now, with the killing of not George Floyd, but not just the killing of George Floyd, but a string of racialized incidents this year and over the past several years has kind of culminated to this one particular event in our national history and global history. The extrajudicial killing on camera sent shockwaves across the country and around the world. So the sight of U.S. and to follow, the sight of U.S. police and security forces heckling protesters, using tear gas, beating up protesters. This is something that was viewed across the world. And unfortunately, this became fodder for America's adversaries, right? So we've seen reports and concerns issued from Iran, Russia, China, things that countries that we would particularly not consider bastions or beacons for human rights, right? These are countries that the United States itself has considered to be adversaries in some way, shape, or form, and where we've given foreign assistance funding, particularly to counter the influence of Russia, China, and Iran throughout the world. So this becomes problematic in a way for many who are working overseas, American diplomats or aid workers, who are trying to work to develop international programs for human rights assistance or technical assistance. For instance, USAID gives something like $40 billion as part of our national budget. And part of that money actually goes for technical assistance to develop societies and political institutions so that there's absence of conflict. So this is particularly important. We're giving money, and we have these things that are, happening within our own society. So one particular aspect I want to mention is we have this idea of American exceptionalism, and American exceptionalism, in my opinion, is twofold. So in one fold, American exceptionalism is that we're very different. Our political history, our experience make us unique than any other society in the world, which is true in many regards, right? It was Michelle Obama who said, "I wake up every day in a house that slaves built," right? So that's an amazing juxtaposition, that her husband being president. On the other side, there is this aspect to where we see things that are so far away, and we don't think these things can happen in America, like ethnic conflict. When I used to teach a class on ethnic conflict, I would always try to remind my students, ethnic conflict isn't something that's far away, that happened in Bosnia in the 90s, or that happens in Yemen, or happens in Africa, right? Ethnic conflict happens in America every day. And there are various examples that we can draw on to posit this. So this idea is that I would argue America is this post-conflict society that is that still has a long ways to go in terms of addressing major human rights concerns in terms of racialized policing. So one thing that we often don't hear in discourse in the media is human rights, and a key part of that is the United States does have human rights obligations that we must live up to. That we've acceded to through international covenants and agreements. So on the other side, when we talk about American exceptionalism, there's this idea that, okay, the rules don't apply to us, right? So this is one of the other key aspects that continue to happen. The United States has been very much involved in developing key international instruments for human rights, right? Even the basic UN Charter was something that we know was supported by Eleanor Roosevelt, right? The very founding of the UN was something that was supported by the United States, and the United States funds a large portion of the United Nations and other key international institutions. So there continues to be this discussion as, well, where do we stand, and as far as human rights, and why isn't there this applicability for the United States? So one of the key things that continues to happen, and that's important, is that as we continue to have these incidences, this blemishes and tarnishes can we ever say that we had a moral standing in terms of human rights? But the work that we've done, it has been important. We have worked to transform societies across the world and address human rights violations. If the United States, for instance, the State Department releases a human rights report every year of regimes and human rights abusers. Some of the two key aspects that are used in diplomatic practices, such as naming and shaming and sanctions. The United States has done this, right? So, for instance, we've sanctioned before Aung San Suu Kyi, we sanctioned the regime in Myanmar, right? The junta before Myanmar supposedly transformed into a democratic society. We sanctioned key military leaders who were a part of the repressive regime. So we have examples of this throughout recent history. Additionally, the United States, we made the premise on the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration did, on furthering democracy and human rights. So, as we continue to have these issues domestically, this blemishes and tarnishes the work that so many are working abroad overseas. And one important aspect is, there are people who know and understand this at all levels of the U.S. government. I think it's important to point that out. Additionally, what's another kind of message or rollback? So 2 years ago, the United States removed itself from the United Nations Human Rights Council. The United States Human Rights Council is the kind of key body that holds states accountable internationally for human rights violations and maintaining a human rights record that falls in line with international standards and law. So the Trump administration essentially asserted that due to the number of human rights violators that sit on the council, and the fact that the council continues to address Israel's record in terms of Gaza and the West Bank, the Trump administration has decided to remove the United States from the Human Rights Council, which brought backlash from across the world, of course, right? So today, if we continue to look now, the Human Rights Council has been very much involved in this discussion over the last week. So 54 the African bloc, which includes 54 countries on the council, has urged an immediate debate on human rights and racism and police brutality in the United States. So earlier this week, I think it was Wednesday, there was a debate within the United Nations Human Rights Council. This is something that the current administration has said, we're not going to particularly, regardless of the resolution, we're going to ignore the resolution, right? But why is this particularly important? So particularly this is important is that the human rights notions or aspects of the United States is being recognized, it is being noticed, and this is important. We've had this issue, we've seen several Black activists and organizations go before the UN also, several UN treaty bodies, and particularly talk about some of these key issues. So we had this after Ferguson. So they're having the same discussion again. So the follow-up from this has been that the UN has voted to kind of create a generic report. Some of the U.S. government, or some of the U.S. allies were very reluctant to create a report on racism and policing that solely focused on the United States, of course, for a variety of reasons. However, Dr.
Why don't we, so why don't you just wrap up a little bit there, and then we can move on to the next panelist, and then the next, and then we can come back.
Sure,
and
yeah.
you can broaden some of your discussions a little bit when we get into the question segment. Okay. So do you want to wrap up a little bit?
Yeah, let me just wrap up. So the key aspect I think here is there has been this, in addition to what's happening in the United States, there is this international discussion or conversation on human rights, as far as the UN Human Rights Chief actually saying, the U.S. and other colonial countries that benefited from colonialism should actually start discussing ways of combating discrimination and also reparations for slavery, for instance. So this is a very important, pivotal conversation that's happening not only in the United States, but internationally. And it's something that as we continue to work abroad, we must keep having this conversation domestically as well. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to Dr. Sharmon Monagan, and she's going to be looking at the question of Black women, of course, African American women, and I think she's contextualizing that within the United States. She's going to be looking at the issue of race, and then she's going to also juxtapose that with the current struggles that we have, the pandemic. So, Dr. Monagan, please.
Thank you. So we heard not only George Floyd, but Eric Garner cry out, "I can't breathe." And we've been in a situation as Black people in the United States where we can't breathe since we reached shores. And it hasn't changed over the years. Some areas have gotten better, but you can't compare slightly better to it being eradicated when their knee is still on our neck. And oftentimes we talk about in our communities how things will get better. We've been lulled into a false sense of security as Black people because many of us didn't have the struggles of our parents and our grandparents. But now, due to COVID, it has put a spotlight on the fissures that were always there. And it's particularly for Black women. There's a quote by Bell Hooks that says, when people acknowledge in one breath that Black women are victimized, and in the same breath, their strength, they imply that though Black women are oppressed, that they manage to circumvent the damage imposed by the oppression by being strong. Usually when people talk about strength of Black women, they are referring to the ways in which they perceive Black women coping with oppression. They ignore the reality to be strong in face of oppression is not the same as overcoming oppression. Endurance is not to be confused with transformation. And what we need now is immediate, aggressive transformation. And one example that sums up the period that we're living in as it relates to Black women, race, and the pandemic is Breonna Taylor. Most of us have heard of Breonna Taylor that was gunned down in a hail of bullets, sleeping in her own apartment by police officers. Police came to serve a no-knock, plainclothes warrant to the wrong house when the person that they were looking for had already been arrested. Yet we rarely hear Breonna's name. We have to fight and struggle, make sure that her name stays in the press and to get attention, unlike some of the Black men that have been killed by police in the recent weeks. As of today, out of the 3 police officers that shot and killed Breonna, only one has recently been fired. The other 2 are still on staff. Breonna worked as an EMT. She was considered essential. And like many Black women, we are essential, but we are invisible and ignored and marginalized. So I want to talk to you about the role of Black women. We've always been the Black backbone of our families, our communities, and our country. We've always been essential. But not only have we been the backbone, but we've been the moral compass. Just as a reminder, Black women didn't vote for Donald Trump. We saw white women take the streets in the days after he was inaugurated to protest against Donald Trump, but white women voted for Donald Trump, not Black women. Black women did not vote for the pedophile Roy Moore down in Alabama. White women did. So we don't need to keep having conversations amongst Black people about racism. We know how horrible it is. We need our white brothers and sisters, our white allies, to have a conversation with one another about how bad and how wrong racism is. But Breonna is an example of everything that's wrong with where we are in this society as it relates to COVID and racism. I can't breathe when we live in a country where we have a history of experimentation, exploitation, and mistreatment when it comes to Black people dealing with our health. Black people are really underserved when it comes to medical care. A lot of it comes from, rightfully so, a mistrust of our medical field. But it's based in a history where we were not treated well, where we were used as experiments. Read the book by Harriet Washington about medical apartheid. So there was a study conducted by Harvard recently that says that racism in and of itself contributes to poor health outcomes, not just socioeconomic impact like the income to go and get health care or access to insurance or access to good care, but racism in and of itself is a cause for poor health care. If you notice during the pandemic, when it first started here in the United States, the media started to report that, hey, there's something going on where Black people are disproportionately dying from COVID-19. And one of the reasons why, and one of the issues that they didn't address was underlying health issues. The media just said, oh, it's underlying health issues, but they didn't discuss where did those underlying health issues come from. So in this report by Harvard, it says that racism, discrimination, and microaggressions have a physical impact on your health and mental well-being. The study states that empirical evidence indicates that socioeconomic effects alone do not account for the racial and ethnic inequalities in health. Racism is considered a fundamental cause of adverse health outcomes. Structural racism, cultural racism, and individual level discrimination are directly linked to mental and physical health outcomes, including high blood pressure and diabetes and inflammation, which causes these issues to put us in a situation where we're predisposed to being great.
Dr. Sharmon, it looks like you're frozen up there a little bit. So are we having communication issues there? Dr. Credle, can you hear me?
I can definitely hear you, T.Y.
Okay, so it looks like we're having communication issues with Dr. Monagan's system. If you can hear us, would you do something to reset your system, please? Okay, she looks like she's been booted out. Okay. Before she comes in, let's just let's take a minute or so of break, and then just kind of wait, because she's the moderator of this stuff. I'm just sort of guiding the conversations. She's the anchor of the panels. So we're still live on Facebook. So Dr. Bell, before Dr. Credle presents, why not just ask you a quick question, and then you can comment on it.
Definitely.
Okay. It looks like she's back. Okay.
Yeah. So if you think about the past decade of racism and the past decade of us seeing Black unarmed men being killed by police, and how much that's impacted our mental health and how that's impacted our physical health, Black people have lived in a constant state of mental distress by that account. So we have to take that into consideration, because the media has almost made it seem as if Black people are having these deaths from COVID because of stuff that we've done to ourselves, like unhealthy eating practices or not exercising. Or I've even heard some politicians recently that said the numbers of COVID have gone up because Black people and people of color don't have good sanitary hygiene. And that's not the case. Racism in and of itself is a mental and physical health issue. The other thing is we have to think about how we're framed, how we're labeled as Black women. We've not only raised and cared for our own families, we've raised and cared for white people's families. We've had to wet nurse other people's babies. We had to raise their babies. We had to take care of their homes. But at one point, if you remember on Google, if you Google Black mothers are, it would say Black mothers are lazy, Black mothers are mean, Black mothers are, crazy, abusive. But if those things were true, why would you ever let us raise your kids if that was true? And that's important. How you're labeled, how you're framed is important, because when you can dehumanize people with your words, then you can brutalize their bodies without second thought. So it's very important for us to think about the framing that goes along with how Black women are treated. Also, we can't breathe when we don't have the income and the wealth that's created in the white community. If you think about Black women, we are the largest growing group of educated people in this country, yet we still lag behind in income and wealth. Black women that graduate with a college degree are graduating in debt because we don't have that generational wealth where our families can take money out of our homes to pay for us to go to college. We weren't left life insurance policies where we can build generational wealth. So Black women are going to college more than ever, but we're still being left behind with income and with wealth because we're graduating with debt. When we go out and apply for jobs, you have issues and barriers to employment, like resumes that have ethnic sounding names are discarded from the jump start. Even when they have comparable resumes, even when they have comparable education and background and work experiences, they're still discarded. Then you have barriers like we're going to do credit checks, whereas Black people, even with comparable good credit, are still given higher interest rates, subprime loans, and things that put people into situations that make their credit bad. So you have to think about those things. Why are we falling behind? Why are we lagging behind as far as income and wealth, and how that impacts our families? Black women have our equal pay day is in mid-August. So that means, for example, for a white man, what he earned in 2018, a Black woman had to work all of 2018 and until August 2019 to earn the same amount. If you think about our wealth is our assets minus our debts. Our wealth, our average wealth is $5 for Black women. Whereas compared to our white counterparts, our white female counterparts, the wealth is over $42,000. You can't even put that in the same bracket, $42,000 in wealth compared to $5 in wealth. Those things are suffocating. Poverty in and of itself is violence. People think that you have to inflict physical violence on people, but poverty is violent. When people have to choose between medicine for their children or paying their utilities, that is violence because we don't have to be there. We choose not to pay people a living wage. We choose not to raise people up out of poverty. And that's an issue in the Black community. The other thing is.
You want to start wrapping up, Dr. Sharmon?
Yes.
All right.
So let me just wrap up saying that there's a few things that people can do to move forward. We need to hold companies accountable. We can't just allow them to post their Black squares or post their hashtag Black Lives Matter. We need to ask them, what are you changing in your hiring practices? How are you going to have more diversity on your board? We need to vote. And once we vote, we need to hold those elected officials accountable. People talk about policing and everything else. You need to vote for the sheriffs. You need to vote for the people in your local community, your mayors, not just everything on the federal level. You need to vote for local, state, and federal. You can use apps like You Decide to find out what's going on in the different party platforms. You can protest. The protests are working. Had people not been in the street protesting, there would not be charges against these police to hold them accountable. You can donate to causes like the Atlanta Solidarity Fund that provides bails to activists. And also, you need to contact your local, state, and federal officials to hold them accountable and not just give us legislation that does nothing. Thank you.
All right. Okay, now we move on to Dr. Stephanie Credle. Dr. Credle is going to be looking at the issue of religion, and religion is pretty large. I mean, you can grab at it from the international perspective, or you can grab at it from just a very dynamic local scenario. She's going to be looking at a U.S. local scenario, but she's going to look at possibly two dimensions of it. She's going to look at religion as a unifying element, and then religion as a disunifying element, and possibly a third dimension may be how religion also plays a role in controlling, human beings. So, Dr. Credle.
Thank you so much, TY. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sharmon, for kind of having this vision for this forum where we can have a voice and lend our collective voices, the things that we have studied so much in academic towers, and bringing those mainstream. I think it's so critically important. Thank you, TY, for kind of wrapping that up for me, because that's exactly where I'm going as it pertains to religious discourse in this country. I'm the author of a book called That's My Pew, which examines conflict as it manifests itself in the historical African-American church in the South. So when I speak about religion from the standpoint of its organization, I'm really speaking from that aspect of religious practice as it was implemented in the slave South. Okay, so that's because religion is such a wide topic. It would be impossible for me to even do anything of justice to it within this time frame. But when you look at religion as it pertained in the South, I want to look at the past. So from the Bush Harbor of slavery, religion has been used in the past to do a couple of things. First of all, and it felt like from the slave owning perspective that it gave the slave, the disenfranchised, a way to release, a way to experience an environment where they could find some balm for their pain. And so, and you look at slave communities, the church and religious played a great role in their coping mechanism. It also played a great factor in that the fact that they were able to bring to the United States some of their culture from their shores of Africa, and infuse that into the religious practice. So religion as it is practiced and implemented by Black folk is a little bit different sometimes than the religious practice that you'll find in the mainstream society. So slaves were able to go to their bush harbors. They were able to meet. That was probably on a plantation level, the only place where slaves could gather in numbers and not be feared. So in that regard, when you are oppressed, you can tend to run to something that tends to be able to give you some sort of peace. The slave also found some similarities. So when I talk about religion, let me make it clear that I'm talking about religion from the Christian Judeo perspective, that the slave found some affinity in the nation of Israel's plight, in their slavery and their being held captive in Egypt for 400 years. And so that there were narratives that paralleled the African experience in the United States. And so when they looked at the religion and the slave owner talked about, Moses, they saw Moses as that they would have a deliverer one day. We would have a deliverer one day. So you found that, when Moses told Pharaoh, let my people go, that was a theme that resonated throughout the slave community. So I think that in some ways, the slave owner thinking that religion would lull did not bank on the fact that religion would also bring about this idea of that one day, when the glory comes, that slavery would be over. So we have this religion that on one side is lulling, but on the other side is empowering and motivating. When we look at religion post-slavery, we would see that the African-American church was instrumental in the civil rights movement. It was instrumental in bringing the Black community together, to providing a place where Black folk could assemble, that where they weren't accepted anywhere else, there was this place they could go where they could learn and grow and have some sense of self-worth and self-esteem. And so it began to be this place where religion, factored in to the community in a way that galvanized us, that gave us some sense of pride and hope. Well, at the same time, when you look at religion from the standpoint of how it furthered this idea of separatism and embracing the slave community, it was used to do that. So I want to call out a verse of scripture. For those of you who don't know, I am also a minister, so I am not bashing the church with this. But I want to tell you how religion was used. So there's a verse in Colossians 3:22, the New Living Translation, that says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." Okay, in everything you do, try to please them all the time, not just when they're watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. So slave owners were using religion as a way to help slaves understand that when you're a good slave, you're serving the Lord. When you're a good slave, you'll get your reward in the by and by. And so we started to sing songs like, y'all hear my preach coming on. By and by, when the morning comes, we're all going to get up and we'll be able to go to heaven. And when we get to heaven, we'll be free. I just don't understand how getting to heaven would be all that free if separatism was the practice of the day. So this religious practice was used to subjugate, keep slaves in line. Slave masters would also use other slaves to deliver the message. And those slaves would begin to even keep the other slaves in line. So if you ever wanted to know, the redemptive value of servitude, or the redemptive value of being submissive to slave ownership, or submissive to being subjugated, it was found in the Word of God. And the Word of God was used as a weapon, as well as a healing balm. And can you imagine how that feels? Can you imagine the dichotomy? Can you imagine the discourse in your mind when you can't reckon your religious practice with why you're being oppressed? And I think that's one of the things that has caused religion over the years to be widely used to keep people down. A few years back, as a pastor in California, Dr. Frederick Price, who called out the Dakes Bible. I had a friend of mine, we were in Bible study one night, he pulls out his Bible, the Dakes Bible, and there in the commentary of the Bible was this commentary that said that this verse of scripture that talked about, don't align yourself with unbelievers, was supportive of don't mix in between the races. This was in the Dakes Bible. It had been there for years until Dr. Price called it out for them. And so what they tried to do when Dr. Price called it out was to say, oh, we did not mean it to be racist. This was not meant to say that we didn't believe that all people were created equal. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the Bible a little bit. But Dr. Price said, no, you need to overhaul the whole thing. So I think that when we are afraid to look at the fact, especially in the community of faith, that our faith practices may have furthered some, discrimination, furthered some things that we really need to then be held accountable for. So I'm calling the church to accountability for the practices that we allowed, especially the church of, and I'm gonna try to put this really the best way I can. The church of the slave master needs to come to accountability. All right, and that's just my point on that. So I just finished writing a book called Coming Together, The Unity of a Nation. And it's based on my own family history. So in my home family history, there was a slave owner, a Methodist slave owner, who was also a Methodist circuit rider minister. So even during the times when slavery was still in effect in the South, my family, half of my family were free, the other half were enslaved. Well, there were massive revivals that took place in our community that were led by Methodist Circuit Rider ministers, where the slave would come together with the free Black and also the white slave owner. So all these communities would come together and they would preach the gospel of redemption and reconciliation and accepting the Lord Jesus as your savior, at the same time struggling with the ownership of other people. And so this is I think what we don't want to take a look at in our nation is that we have had some very duplicitous practices that have not yet seen the light of day on them as we are looking to see what effect that they might have. So I have some memoirs from the slave owner. And one of the things that he says was that he knew he had to divest himself of slaves. And he did. He began to emancipate a lot of his slaves. And he writes, I think it's about time that I leave the state of Virginia because I believe my mind would be freer if I didn't have to live in a state where other people were held captive. Now, here's the kicker for this. At his death, his willed the slaves that were still yet not emancipated, willed those to his children. So tell me, the question I have for you scholars, how does a man who is struggling in his spirit with this idea that he is owning people, who begins to emancipate slaves and free them and liberate them, who is preaching a gospel of inclusion but yet keeping people enslaved? That is something that I believe bears discussion, because if we are not ready to release our people from oppression, I believe it was because he was a landowner, he was a farmer, he was a merchant, and having free labor was key to the sustainment of his family and to his economic development. We have to begin to look at religion and look at how it may further our own personal agendas. And
All right.
okay, so I know you're going to stop me, TY.
Well, okay. So here's how we're going to sort of. You raised some really good questions there. So what we're going to try to do now is to pose. I'm going to try to look at a few of the things that you guys have presented and pose specific questions to each presenter, and all of you can interact on that question. And then when I go to the next presenter, all of you can interact on that question. And so on until we get to Stephanie, and then we'll just pose a general question for everybody to kind of chime in. Does that make sense? So Jared's question is not just for Jared, but it's for the whole panel. So you guys can chime in on that. Okay, so now Jared, your presentation was on human rights, and then you were very concerned about the nature of human rights in the United States. And of course, one of the things that is really amazing about human rights in the United States is, of course, the disguise of white America to say that they are a human rights compliant population, but internally they're destroying their own fellow citizens, right? And that's your concern. And then you raise the issue of how there were good Americans, white and Black and Latino and everybody, who were in systems of developing real good human rights rules and regulations that were presented to the international population. And those were really well received. But then internally, there's this really tragic dehumanization of citizens. But you did say something about the United States, and that's the question I want to pose to you and to everybody in the panel. You mentioned something about the US being a post-conflict scenario. Based on what's happening now, and Sharmon talked about the COVID and women and masculinity, and Dr. Credle talked about the impact of religion, which is still kind of hiding within ourselves and still ongoing. How is it possible to describe the United States as a post-conflict scenario when in fact it is actually the center and architect of conflict that is harming African Americans and other brown and vulnerable populations, Native Americans, and so on? So can you guys work on that a little bit together for me?
Actually, thank you, T.Y. I think this is a really good question. No, honestly, I mean, based on this discourse that we're always reading, I would actually say America is very much a country in conflict, right? So a lot of the discourse that has emerged that we use internationally for peace building programs, human rights programs, et cetera, is based on this idea that a country has emerged from conflict And there's been this clear demarcation that a conflict is over, right? If we look at a conflict spiral, we often see that conflict is over, now two parties can come together. The US context is a little bit difficult because that hasn't happened, right? So we've never had a clear end to racial conflict in the United States. This isn't like, and again, you know, the situation in South Africa was also complicated and complex, but we didn't have an end to this apartheid system, right? There wasn't this kind of renegotiation of how political and social institutions would function in the United States following desegregation, for instance, right? So in the United States, we have this unique system that, okay, we have independent judiciary. We have amendments to the Constitution that included Black and Brown and Indigenous people, right? So to go back to your question, I think we're very much a society in conflict, and a key reason for that is, you know, we've never had an official process that's acknowledged what's happened and this kind of end of a demarcation. We've kind of in a way, swept things under the rug and say, okay, you know, after 1965, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Okay, well, now Blacks have the civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. But we move on from Jim Crowism to mass incarceration. We move on to the war on drugs. So these are key issues that have devastated Black communities, and these are issues that when we talk about human rights, that we've never actually addressed. And Sharmon made a very interesting. She said something interesting: the idea of structural violence. And one thing I want to point out is that people often think that, you know, what happened 400 years ago, what happened 70 years ago, you know, these have impacts, right? History never happens in a vacuum. So these things exist today, and we've never done anything historically to redress these things that are happening. Now we're starting to see banks and sports, the NFL and other things saying, hey, you know, I want to contribute money for development of Black entrepreneurship and Black communities, and et cetera, et cetera. Sure, this is great. But, you know, as this famous song goes, nothing from nothing leaves nothing, right? So many Black, Brown, and Indigenous people particularly have had to kind of fend for their own. And I often point out to the fact that, you know, up until the last 60 to 70 years, you know, Black people actually had the right to control the political capital within their own communities. That's huge. The political capital within their own communities. If you remember before, we had to take literacy tests, right? We had to count marbles. So when we consider the state of Black communities, when we consider the state of what's happening in the United States, it wasn't that long ago before we were denied the right for political enfranchisement, let alone economic enfranchisement. And I'll be done with this, but Sharmon makes a very good point. You know, very few Black families have the capital to invest in education, or to invest in a home, or to invest in a business, right? So, and this isn't to say that all white people are rich or have the opportunities, but there are structural systems that have been put in place for Black people, particularly that have, as Sharmon said, you know, shady credit agencies, shady banks, shady lending practices. These are things that have devastated the Black community and have left adverse effects in terms of credit, right? Your credit's your lifeline, your score. It controls everything. So many communities, you know, don't have the kind of connections that we need, even in terms of being able to hire a lawyer, right? You know. Yeah.
So you're correcting yourself by saying the United States is not a post-conflict scenario. You know, I just want that to be on the record. I would say that because when we think of conflict, often we think of the idea of hot conflict, and it's not, right? It does have elements of hot conflict, but yes, I would agree with you that we are a society that's very much in conflict, definitely. Okay, very good. I think that's important to know. Okay, so now, Dr. Sharmon, do you have any comments on that question, please?
Yes, I think it's interesting that this movement has broadened itself beyond just the borders of the United States, where you see people all around the world marching and protesting on behalf of Black people in the United States. And the thing that Jared and I have kind of talked about is what's different now? What is it that happened now in this period? Because this is not new. We sit and we're horrified
by the recent prison sentence given out to a U.S. citizen over in Russia. He was given 19 years of hard time because he was allegedly spying, and they think it was just, Russia trying to use him as a ploy, as a political swap or something like that. But we see people all the time, particularly Black people, particularly poor people, people of color, that are locked away for lifetime for lesser offenses. So I'm wondering, what is it in this period where it has actually captured not only the attention of people here in the United States, but people around the world? Because from my understanding, the United States has never been a pillar of human rights. We've talked a good game, and we've done a good job to a certain extent of holding other countries accountable when it comes to human rights, but we've never really held ourselves accountable for our own human rights violations right here within our own borders. When you start with our Native American brothers and sisters, and then look at what they've done to Black people, what they did to Japanese people with the internment camps. So I'm just wondering, what is it about this period that has made people become more aware, not just in the United States, but around the world, to the plight of Black people in this country?
Dr. Credle?
I think there is some interpersonal things. I've been reading a book about the impact of the slave state on future generations. And before we get out of here, I'll be able to tell you what that book is. But it talks about the effect of what would happen if slavery, it's called fatal self-deception. Fatal self-deception, and historians looking at what would be the impact of slavery on future generations. What would be the impact not only on the sons of slaves, but what impact would it have on the sons of former slave owners, making them indifferent, calloused to the things that would have to maybe have them more compassionate in their future, that them being slave owners would transcend the institution of slavery and would continue to keep them unaffected by the plights of people in that they have to come into contact with. So I just believe that the foundations that our nation has been founded upon, even though those principles in theory were wonderful, being meted out, they have not been effective to underscore all of the things that has happened in our nation. And I'll give you a good point, Sharmon, you were talking about the plights of women. From a religious standpoint, even in the African-American church, there is still discrimination against women in our churches. And that is even from in the African-American church, holding women in lesser regard. So if injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and we need to look into our own systems also to see how we're subjugating people, how we're not allowing women to have that same level of equality in our own systems. Like Sister Sojourner said, we can all become, free together. We can all be able to experience liberty and freedom together. My liberty does not impact your liberty. And I think we live in a society that looks at this from a zero-sum theory, that if I get mine, it necessarily means that you don't get yours. And I think that's the message that's permeating our nation today, the polarizing language, the us versus them, the other that is being generated through the discourse and the political discourse in our country that is separating us and polarizing us. So I believe that what we are experiencing now is a result of the language of separatism that is allowed to run rampant in our nation. I believe that at some points in the past, we may have thought we arrived. I certainly did in 2000, I believe 2008. I thought we had overcome some things, but subsequent to that, we are seeing racism and separatism and the language of the other permeate our atmosphere. And I believe it's caused a sense of discalm, I guess. And underlying all of this, land of the free and home of the brave, People are now feeling like years have passed and we have not yet overcome. And I believe it sends a sense of desperation for people. And I think that that's what we see happening in our society today. I really feel like we have not really ever had in this nation a truth and reconciliation accountability, that we never really talked about this whole idea of slavery. We came out, we didn't want to look at it. We didn't want it to look as if we were not the people that we proclaimed and purported to be. And to look in the face, in the mirror of and see that we are not as good as we thought we were, I believe is causing a great deal of consternation in this nation. People don't want to look back and see what the impact has been of slavery. And so we still have the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of mindset to say, why didn't you overcome?
So Jared's point basically remains that, because we're contextualizing this within Jared's presentation, which is human rights. So all of you are agreeing that the United States still has to reconcile itself to these tragic violations of internal human rights, and that it needs to do good at home before it starts talking about doing good outside of the United States. That's all of you are agreeing on that. Dr. Credle just made an interesting point about the book that talks historical documentation. It talks about this connection of slavery to this particular experience that we're going through. I remember a couple of years ago, I was teaching, I think it was a sociology class, and I did ask students this very question. I said to them, would you feel responsible in some way, shape, or form for this thing called reparations? And they overwhelmingly said to me, no, we didn't. We're not the slave. We didn't do the slave. We're not connected to that. I said, well, who did? They said, well, I'm not my parent. I'm not my great-great-great-grandparents. I didn't do that. So Black folks shouldn't ask me for reparations or anything of that matter, or to change my, I'm just trying to survive here in America. So that's a really interesting narrative. But when I turned the question around and I said to them, okay, let's assume that somebody came to your door and knocked on your door and said something like, hey, is this who you are? And then you say, yeah. And then it's, well, I have a check here for $10 million that comes from your great-great-great-grandparent. He was a slaveholder in Virginia or Carolinas, and he has identified you as, he did bequeath this money to his great-great-great-grandchild, and you happen to be this person. Would you accept the money? And all of the class overwhelmingly said, yes, they would accept the money. So that's the problem of disconnection, right? And that's what, you all kind of talking about. You can speak about human rights, but if you are not conscious about connecting it to internal kinds of discourses, then you disconnect yourself from actually doing good for your own people. The next question is going to go to Sharmon. And this question is about women. Okay, we talked about masculinity, right? And you pointed out this issue of masculinity, and it is very brutal. You pointed out that Breonna Taylor, who was shot to death in her home, the story is not as magnified as the story of Black masculinity. And so, but you're pointing to something really tragic in there, that you're saying even within the structure of harms and violence against African Americans, there's also a hierarchy of violence that exists within the Black community. And this creates a very interesting impasse for Black folks and for all folks for that matter. And you see that in the white communities where white women are also, subjugated to all kinds of harms, abuse, domestic violence, and so on. So I'd like you guys to, beginning with Dr. Monagan, to comment on this thing, not so much as just commenting on it, but looking for a way to move us forward in terms of, well, what do we do with this? This abuse that you're raising is a very serious charge. How do we mitigate it? Where do we go with it? How do we convince our populations out there, both African Americans, white, and others, what to do to be conscious of this kind of dichotomy in our struggle to make things happen in terms of transformation? Dr. Monagan.
Well, first, I just wanted to add to what Jared and Stephanie said. according to Mitch McConnell, we live in a post-racial America because we elected a Black president, and unfortunately, a lot of people have that mindset. But as it relates to patriarchy, I saw this quote and it kind of stopped me in my tracks where it says, Black men are the white men of the Black community. And let's just think about that for a minute, where people can see the oppression and the dehumanization that happens to themselves, but they can't see how it happens to other people. I've dealt with a lot of people where they can see racism, but they don't see sexism. And it even ties into the church and what Stephanie has talked about, where it's supposed to be this submission. It ties into our past, where we've seen Black women on the forefront of so many movements, whether it was the civil rights movement or today with people with the Black Lives Matter. You see Black women at the forefront, but our voices are often marginalized. Our plight is often marginalized. And so we have to be very conscious of that as we move forward, that we don't just have Black women leading our fights and fighting for our husbands, our brothers, our sons, but that we also have support for people fighting for us, fighting for our daughters, fighting for our mothers. Remember Sandra Bland, we didn't hear about her plight. We did not hit the streets and hold people accountable for what happened to her. We don't know whether she was killed, whether she committed suicide. In prison, in jail, we don't have any videotape like we have with a lot of the cases with Black men brutalized by the police. But we know at the very least, she never should have been arrested. She was arrested only because she was a Black woman that the police felt like was sassy and she spoke back up to him. That's not grounds for arrest. But we didn't hit the streets to protest for her and say, you know what, this type of interaction with police is unacceptable, period. Whether the person ends up dead or not, we shouldn't have those kind of interactions with police. So if you don't address what's happening with Black women, it's going to address the whole Black community. We have to be more proactive about making sure that we are not just standing up for Black men. We have to stand up for Black women. We have to stand up for Black families. We have to stand up for Black communities. And that's as a whole. You can't separate the plight of Black women from the plight of Black men, from the plight of Black children. We have to look at this in a holistic manner and actually deal with the patriarchy within our community.
Yeah, so excellent. Dr. Bell.
I think that Sharmon makes a very excellent point. So one thing that I see on social media that irks me is that there's this attack on Black feminism, or when Black women attempt to be feminists, that they're trying to imitate or mirror white feminism, and it's nowhere near the same thing. We have a theoretical and literary tradition of Black feminism that's totally different. People like Angela Davis, like Toni B. Morrison. So these are some examples of this when we read some of these works that point to the need for Black women to be included in a general discussion and community. So I think Sharmon's right. We have to work to extinguish this kind of androcentrism within the Black community, and it's a huge issue. And notice and take stock of our own traditions of things that Black women are doing, right, and celebrating those particular things and what they've done, right. So I think that's a huge issue, and I think that's what Black Lives Matter was supposed to be, right? And it wasn't just this kind of male-centered or dominated issue around Black men, but exclusively. But this also included trans women. This also included the LGBT community. So this is this kind of holistic approach that I think is important that I think we as a Black community have to address. And I know that's very, some of these things are very controversial within many Black people, because as Stephanie pointed out, these are things that are still very much rooted in Christian dogma that is very much still at the center of many Black families and many Black communities. So I just wanted to add that. I think that was an excellent point.
Yeah, I think the Me Too movement too, the young African-American woman that started the Me Too movement was focused on this violence in the Black community, against Black women. Dr. Credle.
So absolutely, totally agree I think this whole idea of paternalism as it pertains to the conflict that we see in the African American community, I can tell you that even today in 2020, that there are churches where as a minister, I am not allowed as a Black woman or as a woman to be able to operate in ministry because the stigma that women are to be silent and men are to be revered. And I think that in the African American community, in my research for my dissertation, one of the main points of conflict in the Black church was this feeling that Black men, that the church gave Black men a voice. And when Black men got that voice, they felt like as Black women, they were okay with subjugating themselves, even in the church, to be able to defer to the Black male. And that's where we are real right now, is that we still have this paternalism that exists. I believe that a lot of that has been fostered by practices as a nation when it came down to how aid was disseminated in the Black community, where a woman could get a certain amount of aid if she didn't have a Black man in the house. So I just believe that there's been a lot of attempts to separate the African American community. And I think that when you start looking at when we can all come together in the African American community, recognizing the worth and the value that the woman brings, and that you don't have to be subjugated to be able to do that. I think we still have a long way to go with addressing that. And from the point of Sojourner Truth says, I can do a whole bunch of things just like a man, but I am a woman. So for African American women, you carry these two mantles of being discriminated against, even in our society today, looking at employment, looking at salary disparities still in our society today. So we have to be able to address that. And perhaps there is this idea of the wrenching away of power from a Black man who does not have his own power yet, has not come into his own yet, is the sharing of that power with the Black woman. If I'm empowered, does that make the Black man even less empowered? So I think those are some of the things we need to think about, even from this idea of the slave state, how women were treated, and from a standpoint of being mutilated, being used. And so I don't know if that's created some type of a separatism from the standpoint of just having to think about, in order for men to think about their women, they had to become somewhat desensitized because of the things that were happening to women in the slave community. So we just have to really look back and start looking at the practices and looking at them and being willing to look back, willing to face our past.
All right. So I know Sharmon's got a comment there, but can you hold that comment so that I can go to Dr. Credle on her particular presentation, and then we can come back and then we do just general comments. So just keep that comment there. Dr. Credle, in your presentation, you talked about this religion as this, factorial element that either unites, brings, or divides people or control people. Just something to add there is the fact that when Africans were brought forcibly into the United States, they did bring a lot of their religions, and you see a lot of that still in Brazil, Bahia, and many other places. But for some reason in the United States, you point to the use of this particular so-called Christian religion to co-opt the African religions and to demonize African religions, and to almost tell Africans that religion was hedonistic and ridiculous, and then that Christianity was going to be their salvation. Hence, you're pointing to the dynamics of, the idea of, religion, slaves be obedient to your masters in Colossians and all of those things, right? So that's really well and good, but you make a very interesting point that I'd like all of you to comment on now, which is that you point to the religion of the mainstream, as if you're saying the Africans that brought their religions and the Muslims who were here since the 1700s, as if their religions were not useful or mainstream. And I'm just worried that you're saying mainstream helps supremacists to say their religion is better. And I think something in the Constitution suggests that, you know, no religion in public domains, and all religions should be practiced wherever, even if it had only 2 or 3 people. So comment on that. What is the impact of mainstreaming, of using the terminologies mainstream for some religions, and then of other religions, you know, saying, you know, otherwise, right? So.
Right. So by mainstream, what I meant by mainstream was the mainstream religion of the particular planter merchant in the South. That for the most part, the religious practice of the plantation owner was the religion from a Judeo-Christian perspective.
So it is not mainstream, it is just their religion practiced by them.
Right. Not
yeah, so like, you need to clarify that, right?
Absolutely. Clarifying that what I intended by mainstream was what was the general religious practice of the slave owner, okay? And in the South, primarily that was from a Judeo-Christian perspective in this nation. And I believe, as I said before, that it was, in the South, there was this whole idea of the evangelism of the colonies, as it was practiced by John Wesley and other pioneers and protesters of the faith, as they began to come to the Americas to be able to bring in what they felt was the reformation of religious practice in the United States. So all of those things coming into play, I believe, is what I'm terming a mainstream approach. That was the religious practice that was allowed. And so because that was the religious practice that was allowed, that was when you're only allowed to do one particular thing, then of course, given that liberty to express yourself and to, I believe, inculcating in each human heart is this idea of thinking that there's someone greater than we are. Given that opportunity to exercise that, well, I will let you do this, but you're certainly not going to do these practices, okay? So therefore, yes, Africans came to this country with their own religious practices. But when you come into my area, or I'm allowing you into my realm, but I'm only allowing you to practice in this regard. Okay, this is the only thing that I'm going to not, I guess, oppress you about. So this was considered by the slave owner as a tame religion. It also, there's some things in religious practice, the Ham curse, you know? So if I'm looking at you as descendants of Ham, then you are a cursed people and subject to certain practices. So therefore it is okay that I treat you differently. So all of these are in that religious narrative, the separation of the races and ordained slavery. Even though I think the African not being able to know the language or read the language, when we begin to read the Bible for ourselves, we begin to see that this whole idea of slavery did not have its roots in years and years and years of servitude. But back then it was used to say, being a slave is a good thing. So,
yeah. So Dr. Bell, this religion is also part of human rights, right? I mean, you think about it, right? So you think of, in the United States, there is really, no practice of African traditional religion. Yet in Africa, we have African traditional religions, right? Yes. I mean, you think about it. So now I'd like you to comment on Dr. Credle's presentation there, focusing on this specific question that I raised. Now, why mainstream? Is that a form of human rights violation?
I think when we look at the U.S. Constitution, there is a separation of church and state. There technically isn't an official state religion in the United States. But to go back, I would agree with Stephanie 100%. I mean, I think that, religion, and, I've been seeing discussions on social movements where, there are some Black people are saying, well, why do you still practice Christianity when that was the slave master's religion, right? so to go back to, and I'm glad you brought it up, TY, because it's very interesting that, you know, many people don't know that many of the slaves who were actually brought here were Muslims, right? And so people converted here in the United States, or in the United States, as a result of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So personally, I don't think there's, you know, this mainstream idea, but I think but I think religiosity is very much important part of our community. And you know, I go back to what Stephanie said. I think that's where we tied our struggle to, right? So you know, I don't want to, you know, as Stephanie said, I don't want to, like, you know, how do you say, admonish religion, because that's not what I'm trying to say. But, you know, we got the right for struggle and human rights from the Bible, right? We can look back on many of Martin Luther King's sermons. You know, this kind of moral right, a moral hegemony for civil rights and human rights came from the very same Bible that was used to oppress people, right? So it's this amazing dichotomy. There's this the American African American religious experience is one of the most unique in the world. And it's funny, I had some of my students here ask me in Bosnia, I was teaching, like, professor, you know, I want to go to a Black church. Like, that's what I want to do. I want to go to the United States. I want to go to the Black church. I want to listen to gospel music. So this, you know, getting back to the international point, is that this, you know, a culture and custom that came out of struggle, that came out of we shall overcome. I mean, as Stephanie said, this is something that was tied to Israel, right? It was tied to, you know, the repression of the Hebrews in Egypt. So I think this is something that's a you know, a great part of our tradition as Black people. But at the same time, you know, I would agree that, you know, this is always a controversial comment. You know, I think we have to kind of modernize in a way and move forward beyond some of these, you know, where we have to talk about women and, you know, the role of women in the Black community. We have to talk about the role of the LGBTQIA in the Black community. I mean, these are things that, you know, if we look even, you know, just to kind of, you know, to kick it up a notch, we look at the issue of HIV and AIDS in the Black community over the last 30 years. I always said, in my opinion, this is something that the Black church should have been front and foremost to have these discussions on HIV and AIDS in the Black community, and not shy away from this discussion, because this is something that out of any institution, the Black church is the most powerful institution in our communities. And and again, going back to the civil rights movement, this is where we get the moral right, and where we develop the moral outrage to say, wait a minute, you know, this is wrong. Segregation's wrong. The way we're being treated is not in line with what the Creator has willed for all people. So,
right. Yeah. All right. So, Dr. Sharmon, religion and women.
So with religion, particularly in the Black church, it can be liberating, but it also is very problematic. And I think if we don't address that honestly, we are going to continue to find ourselves in that situation where our issues are not being addressed. The thing that's very difficult about religion is, if for two reasons, from a race perspective and from a gender perspective, if you have a white Christian God and the word is from God, who are we as Black people, who are we as women to push back against the God of our faith? That's a difficult thing to do. And so you have to get people in a different mindset where we can have a critique of the church without diminishing our faith. One thing about the wake of 9/11, we put a lot of pressure on Muslims to denounce the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in a way that we do not put pressure on Christians in this country, and particularly white Christians, to address the issue of domestic terrorism and the terrorism, because that's what it is, the terrorism that Black people live under each and every day in this country. And so that's a hard place to get to, and it's a hard pill to swallow when you are not just having to come up against, to question a man, a human being, but your God, that's a hard place to be. And then kind of tying back to the last question that we talked about with Dr. King in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? That was his speech for his Nobel Peace Prize, but also the last the World House was the speech that he gave for the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was the last chapter of his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? And one of the things that he talked about is that we have the resources and the capability to address every issue that we face as a world, but we choose not to. And so to me, we can address the issues of race, we can address the issues of poverty, but there's something in our spirit, there's something innate in our spirit where we almost like the idea of the haves and the have-nots, the superior class and the inferior class, the better people, the good people, and the lesser people. So I think beyond just race and gender, we need to get some kind of understanding about that as human beings. What is it in us that we are okay with the sufferings of the people that we deem other? Whether it's women, whether it's Black people, whether it's a certain ethnicity, whether it's a certain religion, what is that? We need to get to the bottom of that issue.
All right, thank you. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to give, I'm going to give, we're going to sort of give each of us the last, don't make it too long. I know people have been watching us and listening. Just a minute and a half of a summary of your idea today and what you like people to live with. So we'll begin with Dr. Credle, and then we'll go to Jared, and then we'll go to Sharmon, and then that will be the end of the session. So Dr. Credle, please.
Thank you, TY. I just had to, before I give what I'd like to see happen, is to speak to what Sharmon said about women in the church. And I think it transcends religious denomination. I believe that women are somewhat subjugated, regardless of whether you are from a Judeo-Christian perspective or from a Muslim perspective. And we have to deal with those things in our religious practice. What I would like to see happening is I would like to see progress made on breaking the barriers that exist that keep people from moving freely and from progressing. And what I mean by that is I'm seeing a lot of effort toward pulling down of statues, of changing the names of different products, of eliminating the photographs from different products. And I understand that. I think that it causes some types, it brings us back to the things that we've had to deal with in our past. I'm more interested in what you're going to do to break barriers. I'm more interested in knowing what corporations are going to do to eliminate the bias in their hiring practices. I'm more interested in what we're going to do to open up opportunity and not restrict people based on gender or race. And I think that's the harder practice that needs to happen, because I believe we've become comfortable in where we are positioned in this nation. I used to play basketball, and when I was in high school, we played basketball in a gym that had little places in the floor that were that had what we call, I guess, the humps in the floor, that wherever your basketball hit that hump, it would fly off into the out of bounds. And I think that's how we've been dealing with as a people, is that we've been playing on a field that we didn't recognize, that we weren't given all of the information about. And it has restricted our ability to move forward, to occupy places where we could excel, because of we are equipped with all that we need to be, to operate in those places. I think that now we're going to have to look at plans where businesses and communities examine their barriers, eliminate the barriers. And I don't just mean pictures on a bottle of syrup. I mean, eliminating the barriers that you've put in place in your organizations that restrict and keep people subjugated, where you still have places where women and minorities don't occupy from an equitable standpoint. these places in our nation. So we have got to be able to do that. I want to see progress, and I want to see plans and some type of even consent decrees over areas that have historically been, I guess, not open to diversity and inclusion.
All right, thanks. Dr. Jarrett, please.
So one of the key things that I think that's important moving on to human rights, and I think I want to touch on Stephanie's point, I think to wrap up what I had to say is, I think in the United States we need institutional reform. I think pulling down statues is great. It kind of gives us the shift for cultural reform. I think corporations with black squares, I think that's great. I think corporations, and sports teams and whatever, vowing to give money to further black causes, even talking about police reform. But that underscores the actual systematic racism. Let's be honest, we're not going to get rid of systematic racism overnight. And so let's not pretend, right? We have a long way to go. And, a lot of that, that we see in international development, right? Even in Bosnia, the US and the international community sank billions of dollars in Bosnia, and it still has many issues as far as corruption. Bosnia's whole political system violates human rights. So in this particular instance, we have a long way to go. And so let's not underscore that, and let's keep our eye on what's important. Institutional reform is one of the key aspects when you talk about transitional justice and human rights. One of the key principles of transitional justice is the guarantees of non-recurrence. And so first, I think we need a process to address what's happened. Two, we need to work on creating, reforming institutions so there is this guarantee of non-recurrence. And a part of that is having the reforms necessary. And just to touch on one other quick thing, at no point do I think the United States should not be a major advocate for human rights. It's integral, it's important to our national security more than we ever think. The money that we get, I'm not saying this because I work for USAID, I'm not saying this, but the funding and support we give around the world to build institutions makes a huge difference, and it's important, right? So from this international perspective, international relations, this side of diplomacy and development is extremely important for maintaining U.S. national interest, maintaining security. So let's not underscore that. And this is why it's particularly important that we can't lose credibility on the international stage. Is when the United States loses credibility, even though we're getting mocking, mocking tones from Russia, China, and Iran. At the end of the day, it's still the U.S. that has this kind of sort of moral credibility in terms of promoting human rights, promoting democracy, promoting economic development, promoting capital. These are definitely things we should be doing at home, but we have to do them in parallel. So that's what I have to add, and thank you.
All right, very good. Dr. Monahan, please.
So I think human rights starts at home. That's where we need to start. We need to lead by example, and that can start in our churches. That can start within our community. Our white brothers and sisters, our white allies, we need you to have conversations with your white church members, with your family members, with your coworkers, and with your friends about racism and the harms of racism. We're already well aware of it because we live it daily. I think another thing is that we need to have an understanding within the Black community is that in order for us to protect our community as Black people, we have to protect our Black women. When we protect the Black women, we protect Black men, we protect our Black children. So remember and say her name, Breonna Taylor. Remember her plight. Remember how symbolic she is in this current state of dealing with COVID-19 and the racial injustice that we see going on in America. So I would highly recommend to everybody that you vote. If our voting was not important, they wouldn't try so hard to keep us from voting. Once you vote, to hold those elected officials accountable, not just to give us lip service, not just to show up at our churches when they're running for office and then we never see or hear from them again. I encourage people to continue to protest. The protests work. unlike our tears, unlike our voices crying out for help, when people hit the streets, that's when things tend to change. That's when we tend to see some movement as far as getting some type of justice or getting a step towards justice. And also to support organizations that are doing the work out in the field, whether it's bail reform, police reform, legislation, whatever it is, hiring practices. We need to support those organizations that are doing the work in the field. I just want to thank all of the panelists and our moderator, Dr. Bell, Dr. Credle, and Dr. Okosun. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate our viewers for listening to us and for adding to the conversation. So I thank you and I appreciate it. I'll turn it over to our moderator for the final words.
So I think at this point, though, the United States understands that a lot of African Americans, if not all African Americans, have no intention of ever dismantling or disorganizing the U.S. as a nation. What African Americans have asked for is something very simple: a respect of their human rights, a respect of their dignity, a respect of their self-determination, just like other white families have enjoyed and experienced in the U.S. So this conversation, the previous conversation, and this conversation underscores that one more time, that we are in solidarity with all of those young white brothers and sisters who were out on the streets protesting with us as we ask for just this recognition of our rights and dignity and self-determination, and then the equal access to be protected and served as citizens. That's what we're asking for. And this particular presentation underscores this again. So for many of our white brothers and sisters, we have asked you, please, like Sharmon said, start a civil rights organization amongst yourselves. Dr. Credle made that clear. Within the white churches, the idea of liberating yourself. Religion is not immutable. Liberating yourself so that you can move in a different direction, which is the direction that people like Martin Luther King called for years ago. Where do we go from here? And Dr. Bell is also mentioning this in the idea of you can run the two together. You can have human rights outside of the country, and you can have human rights and protection of dignity within the country. So that entails doing some very difficult things. The police systems and the legal systems as we have them have not been really helpful. And it would entail, like Dr. Credle says, dismantling them. You can't keep them as they are. You've got to do something more radical than that.
Exactly.
And this is in the hands of our white brothers and sisters. We will support you. We have been asking for that. So, and I want to thank Dr. Credle, Dr. Bell, and Dr. Sharmon Monagan for being the Atlanta-based organizer of these panels. There's going to be another panel coming up in a few days from now. And that concludes our session for today. So thank you, everybody, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.